Top dog names of 2019 coming up. Welcome to the Dog Blog. If you like fun dog stuff, you're at the right place. And we'd love you to join us by subscribing. The Happy Puppy website does a massive survey of popular top dog names, and that includes the top dog names of 2019. I'll share those results in a minute, and I'd also like to share some useful tips on coming up with your own names that are meaningful, fun, and just particularly fitting for your unique dog. And lastly, Skeen, I have a very special story about how you got your name. So for the top dog names of 2019, the top male dog names are Max, Bear, Charlie, Coco, and Cooper. Top female names are Bella, Luna, Molly, Daisy, and Ruby. I think I know almost all of those dogs. So how to come up with that appropriate dog name? Your dog is going to be with you probably a decade and a half, and so you obviously want to be comfortable with the name that you choose. But sometimes it's hard just finding that name that's a perfect fit for your pooch. Well, one of the things that I do is to pick an attribute or a trait that really represents that dog. For example, my dog Keegan, when I first got him, I knew that he was a real fireball. Very hyper, really wound up and a busy dog. He also was a red border collie. He's actually, you could call it a liver colored, but considered a red border collie. So I knew I wanted something that represented fire. And I looked around, found that the name Keegan actually means little fire or small flame. And some people don't like using human names for their dogs, but if it fits, I think it's absolutely fine. And I don't have a problem at all using human names for dogs. It's just a personal preference. So for me, sometimes just choosing a trait can help me narrow down what I'm looking for in figuring out that perfect name. Choosing a dog name based on color is another idea. I really like the name Raven. If I had an all-black dog that was a little bit smart, maybe a bit mischievous, I would really consider the name Raven for a dog. I also had a dog that I named partly based on color. His name was Merlin. He was a blue merle, actually what they call a self merle, because he had little white in him. For those that don't know, the merle color is kind of a speckled gray black. He also had really sparkly blue eyes, very intense blue eyes, and they had little stars in them, which made him really look mystical. So Merlin was such a perfect fit for him because he was kind of a magical looking dog, and then the merle really fit with the whole name Merlin. Merlin was really kind of a color-based name, but also just completely fit his personality. I also want to mention that I'm not a fan of naming dogs derogatory names, you know, even if they're meant to be funny or fun. I had a friend who named his dog Fat Man, and at the time he thought that was cute because there was a show called Jake and the Fat Man, and there were some neighbor kids that called the dog Fat Man just as their own little nickname, and he wanted to stick with this name that the neighbor kids had come up with. I was just never ever comfortable calling this dog by name. And I mean, if you can imagine, you know, pick a name that you're not going to mind yelling across the field when your dog is taking off after a rabbit or something like that. And hopefully you're going to train your dog not to go after rabbits. But these are things that you want to really think about, and I think most people do, but there's the odd time that someone just comes up with something that they don't really consider how that's going to affect their relationship with the dog over time. And I mean, you can still have a fun and funny name, but it's good to consider whether it could come across as a put down or actually offensive to somebody who's hearing you call this dog's name. One of the things you can do just to get started is to write a list of characteristics that remind you of your dog. So is your dog busy, carefree, independent, beautiful, free-spirited? These are just things to get you started coming up with the ideas. Another way you can choose a dog name is by possibly a life circumstance or a situation that brought the two of you together. My dog Chance came from South Carolina from Australian Shepherd Rescue, and I named him Chance because, first of all, I thought it was pretty amazing that I was able to bring him all the way from South Carolina to my home here in Nanaimo, BC, Canada. And second of all, I wanted him to have a second chance at life. He was a dog that had a few issues, and I had to work really hard to help him to be a balanced and happy dog. And I believe he really had that chance. And for me, that was a good name, just to represent what I wanted for that dog. And I did kind of the same thing in naming my dog Asha, because Asha is a Sanskrit name for hope. And when I first met Asha, she was a very, very terrified little border collie and just had not been exposed to very much in her little life and was just terrified of sounds and people and pretty much every situation. She was a dog that I saw a lot of potential to come out of her shell and be a more happy, confident dog. And so that's what I wanted to focus on with her. And so Asha and the meaning of hope was really appropriate. I also named my dog Sprite based on characteristics. At the time when I first adopted her, she was quite a thin, smaller dog, and she grew into herself, and she really ended up being a medium-sized border collie. But the Sprite sense was not so much about her size, but more about her spirit and her vivacious, playful personality. She was definitely a sprite full of spirit and zest for life. You can also name a dog after a hobby or a favorite place or even somebody famous. I have a friend who named her dog Yalapa because the dog was rescued from the beach city Yalapa in Mexico. Some people even name their dogs after products or even automobiles. Cooper, Chevy, Dakota. Also, how many syllables should your dog's name contain? And that's another personal choice, and there's different opinions about that. But I generally have chosen names that are either 1 or 2 syllables, just because I like a shorter, choppier name to call your dog immediately and get their attention. But if you do choose a longer name, you can also shorten it for day-to-day use. So for example, I have a friend whose Newfie's name is General, but for day-to-day use, she often calls him Jen. You also might want to think about whether the name that you choose sounds similar to either another person in the house or another pet. So my puppy Skeen sounds somewhat similar to Keegan, and I did think about this when I chose the name, but I really felt that the name Skeen fit, and we'll explain more about that in a minute. And so what I actually do is when I'm calling Skeen, I really put a lot of emphasis on the S, so Skeen. And when I'm calling Keegan, I put more emphasis on the Keegan. And there's always ways that you can work with that, but you really don't want to choose 2 names that sound really identical. Another thing you might want to think about is what commands do you use when you're calling the dog or when you're working with the dog. So for example, I use for my healing command, I often say with me. So I probably wouldn't want to pick a name like Whitney, you know, for obvious purposes. Another thing, like the word wait. I use the word wait instead of stay sometimes. Well, I wouldn't want to pick the name Wade for a male dog or female dog for that matter if I wanted to use that command on a frequent basis, because it can be confusing.
And lastly, Skeen, I have a very special story about how you got your name.
So I had an interesting thing happen on April the 4th of this year. I woke up remembering a dream about my dog Sprite. And some of us have had those dreams where they're just very realistic, and Sprite was there just like she always was. But the interesting part of the dream was that I knew she had passed, and I knew that even though she had passed, she was there just as real as she ever was. And the message of that dream was telling me that our sense of time and our sense of death just isn't all the whole picture. And so what happened later in that day, and why this is important, is that my dad, who had been sick for several years, finally stopped eating that day. So it was a really special dream, and it actually helped me to get through a really tumultuous and emotional time as my dad was slowly slipping away during the last 10 days of his life. On April 14th, my dad passed away. So 3 days later, this little adorable guy showed up on the Victoria Humane Society website, and I just couldn't stop looking at this little face. But it's not always easy to get the dog that you hope to get, and I wondered if, with everything going on with my dad's death, if things were really going to work out. And obviously, obviously they did. To make a long story short, things just fell into place, and he ended up coming home with me. So the interesting thing with him is that he came from Saskatchewan, and my dad also came from Saskatchewan. All right, I'll let you down, mister. I'll let you down. After I brought Skeen home, I knew pretty quickly which name I was going to choose. And the name Skeen is actually my father's middle name. It's a very uncommon first name, but it was a maiden name of a relative and used as my father's middle name. So I like to think of little Skeen as a gift from my father. I hope you find the perfect name for your special pet. I'd also love to hear if you have a specific method or way of choosing pets' names, or if you have a special story about how your pet's name came to be. Also, if you'd like to watch Skeen grow up, or if you like fun dog stuff, we'd love for you to subscribe and join us on our adventures. Whatever name you choose, paws up to a great life together.